Welcome to Austinville, the most historically underrated town in Virginia. The town began its life as a lead mine, and then as the county seat for Fincastle County, which stretched from here all the way to the mighty Mississippi. Stephen Austin, the father of Texas, was born here, and a precursor to the Declaration of Independence was written here, 18 months before the actual Declaration of Independence was written. Because of the lead mines, they saw action in the Revolutionary and the Civil War. As industries changed, they stopped mining lead and began mining zinc, and the pollutants from that caused this to be an EPA Superfund site, which is now closed. But the mine is still open. It is the oldest operating mine in America, and now they mine limestone. Austinville has a twin town called Ivanhoe, and I've done a video about that. If you've seen it already, you can skip to about the 14-minute mark because the history is going to be the same until the towns get their different names. Pre-Revolutionary War. Fort Chiswell was built in 1752 during the French and Indian War to protect settlers traveling down the Great Wagon Road. The millstones in the monument are the actual millstones that the mill at the fort used. The fort sat at an important junction where the pioneers could either turn and head south to the Carolinas or continue west towards Tennessee and Kentucky. The Great Road began at the port of Philadelphia and traveled through southwest Virginia. The road never ceased to exist, it just got covered in asphalt, and although it's gone through several names through the years, today we call it Route 11. Interstate 81 also closely follows it. The other trail, going south into the Carolinas, is now called Route 52 and is closely followed by Interstate 77. Route 52 crosses the New River at Jackson Ferry Bridge. The first crossing of the river here was in 1770 when a ferry was operated by British Captain William Herbert. The Jackson that the bridge is named after wouldn't show up here until 1806. Fort Chiswell was built at the beginning of the French and Indian War. England and France were fighting in the Americas, and since France was greatly outnumbered, they paid native tribes to side with them, including the Shawnee. Several years after the fort was built, and a few miles away from it, Colonel Chiswell was exploring the banks of the New River when he ran into a Shawnee hunting party. Not wanting to get his day ruined, he ran and saw a cave, so he jumped in it. As he waited for them to pass, he explored, and he found large deposits of lead. In 1761, Colonel Chiswell set up a mining operation on the south side of the river. He bought a bunch of enslaved Africans and British indentured servants to operate it. Problem was, none of them had any mining experience, and the operation failed miserably. Chiswell sailed back to England and went to Wales, where they have a lot of coal mining. He hired a mine manager and a whole crew of miners. After they got here, the mine production increased, but after some time passed, the Welsh miners became slaves, just like everybody else in the mine. A few years later, in 1766, Colonel Chiswell did some frontier stuff in polite society, and then, while he was in jail awaiting trial, he unalived himself. He had two investors, and one of them got in trouble for financial crimes, and that left William Byrd the sole owner. He was a member of the House of Burgesses, which is the pre-revolutionary government, but he was also a notorious gambler. His contribution to the mines was he imported more slave labor. The Revolutionary War. James McGavick was born in Ireland in 1728. He sailed to Philadelphia in 1755 and then he traveled down the Great Road to the modern-day Fincastle, Virginia. There, he ran an inn for travelers that passed by. He got married and had 10 children. In 1770, he sold his land in Fincastle and bought some by Fort Chiswell and the lead mines. He built a house called Poplar Camp and ran a business catering to pioneers traveling down the 2 trails. Now, this is not his house. His was by Austinville, but this is the Fort Chiswell Manor, and it was built by his sons in 1840. It's the house on the hill that you see at the junction of Interstate 81 and 77 South. To fund the French and Indian War, in 1765, England passed the Tax Act, which required the colonists to use paper with a tax stamp on it for all legal documents. Along with other things, this was a direct tax on the colonists. Then, in 1767 and 68, the Townshend Acts were passed, which put a sales tax on the colonists, allowed British companies to import goods duty-free, and also blocked the colonists from having their own governing bodies that were independent from the British. 8 years after the stamp tax was passed, the duty-free tax on tea was reassessed in 1773, and that was called the Tea Act. At the time of the Tea Act, 86% of the tea in America was smuggled in by the Dutch, and this was done by the British to get the colonists to buy tea from them. Their plan went horribly wrong when a bunch of colonists in Boston, dressed up as Native Americans, boarded a ship full of British tea and threw it into the harbor. Making matters worse, the British really only had control of the city of Boston, but the countryside around it was controlled by illegal colonial governments. To protest, they began closing government buildings like courthouses, and also began a boycott on imported British goods so they wouldn't get paid in tax. To say tensions were getting high would be an understatement. I had to explain all of that so you would understand the backdrop of what James McGavick is about to do here in Virginia. So that's what's going on in Boston in 1755, and at the same time in Virginia. All of this is Fincastle County, which stretches from the modern-day town of Fincastle, which is by Roanoke, all the way to the Mississippi River. And the county seat of this whole giant county is the lead mines near Fort Chiswell. They don't actually have a name yet, they're just called the lead mines near Fort Chiswell. The lead mines are now in Wythe County, but Wythe County wasn't formed until 1790 and is named after George Wythe, the first person from Virginia to sign the Declaration of Independence, but he had nothing to do with this area. The same year as the Boston Tea Party, James McGavick joins the County Safety Committee because he's concerned about the growing hostilities. He would host the meetings at his tavern near the lead mines. This monument was built on the location of his tavern in Austinville, but it's not very photogenic and it's in someone's front yard, and that's why we're looking at that pretty house. At one of those meetings, 15 elected county representatives wrote the Fincastle Resolution. It was in response to all that stuff I just told you about. And basically it said we support the British, but if they don't stop messing with us, we're going to fight them. James McGavick not only hosted the meeting that the Fincastle Resolution was written at, but he also signed it. That was January. Now fast forward a couple months to April, it's springtime, and in Boston, the snow's starting to melt. That means for the British Army, it's the beginning of fighting season. So someone gets the great idea, hey, let's go try to disarm all the militia that controls the countryside outside the city. It didn't work out too well for the British, and after they lost the Battle of Lexington, then they lost the Battle of Concord, and they were sent running back to Boston. No one knew it then, but now that is considered the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Virginia's representative brought up the Fincastle Resolution at the Continental Congress, and 18 months after it was written, on July 4th, 1776, a revised version of it was signed by our founding fathers. We call it the Declaration of Independence. If you had no idea that America was in active conflict for over a year before the Declaration of Independence was signed, hit the like button. Maybe you're asking yourself, how does it work signing this treasonous document when you live right next to a military base? Well, it worked out great for these guys, because the British got the message and they packed up and left. The militia took over Fort Chiswell, and they used it to protect their new lead mines, which they commissioned to make ammunition for the Continental Army. In 1777, Virginia Governor Benjamin Franklin appointed Militia Colonel Charles Lynch to oversee the mine. The lead in 150-pound bars was to be taken to the settlement that would become Lynchburg, 130 miles away, in a horse-drawn cart. Lynchburg is not named after Charles Lynch, but instead his brother John Lynch, who spent the Revolutionary War playing safety for the Denver Broncos. After the lead reached Lynchburg, which then was called Lynch's Ferry, it was put on barges and floated down the James River. To increase production, condemned men were sent from a jail in Williamsburg to be more slave labor. The mixed race group had all been sentenced to death. Not much was written about the white men, but all the black men had committed a crime in the process of escaping. The guards fortified the mine, not just to defend against the British, but now they had a growing fear of a slave revolt. Several years after the Revolution began, in 1780, there was an uprising of British loyalists called Tories. Most of the fighting-age males that supported the Revolution had gone off to fight in it, while most of the British army was imported. That created a power vacuum, where the only fighting-age males left were the Tories. They began to form militias and terrorize the Carolinas. Then they turned north and started to head to Virginia. The Virginia militias began to gather at the lead mines. Then they headed south. They met the Tories in Surry County, North Carolina. The only place to cross the Yadkin River was the shallow ford crossing. As the Tories began to wade through the river, the Virginia militia ambushed them, having target practice with everyone stuck in the water. Several days later, all the Tories were rounded up and they were given a pardon. Colonel Lynch, the mine superintendent, found himself in a similar situation, except instead of issuing a pardon, he helped Charles at his plantation in Alta Vista. The sentences were very light, but the worst offenders were tied to a black walnut tree and given 39 lashes. After the Revolution, the Virginia legislature passed a bill absolving militia leaders who administered justice in the absence of a court system of any guilt. It became known as Lynch's Law. Stephen Austin, the father of Texas.
In 1789, Moses Austin got control of the mines and he named the town after himself, making it Austinville. In 1793, his third child was born. Now that kid, his name was Stephen Fuller Austin, and he would become the father of Texas. Moses Austin wasn't the best businessman, and in 1802, he had to run away to Missouri to escape his debtors.
At that time, the Mississippi River was America's western border, so by crossing it into Missouri, now he was in Spanish territory, and he petitioned them to allow him to operate lead mines in St. Genevieve. Meanwhile, Steve Austin was mainly growing up in Connecticut, being raised by family members and attending the finest schools. In 1810, he graduated from the Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. Then he returned to Missouri to work for his dad at the lead mines. During the War of 1812, Steve Austin took a shipment of lead, musket balls, down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. The War of 1812 is when the British tried to retake America. In 1814, Major General Edward Pakenham attacked New Orleans with 60 ships and 9,000 men. Waiting for him was future President Andrew Jackson. He commanded a force half the size of the British, with a total of 4,700 men. He commanded the 7th U.S. Infantry. He had 58 Marines, volunteer militia, free blacks, Native Americans, and of course, pirates. Jean Lafitte had a small colony of islands in a bay near New Orleans. The islands were used as a staging point for goods that had been stolen from Spanish ships to be smuggled into the city for resale. Before the invasion, the British offered him money and a job if they could use his bay. He agreed, but then sent word to Andrew Jackson that he had set a trap for the British. Unfortunately for Lafitte, everyone was tired of his nonsense, and Governor Claiborne sent the army and the navy to destroy his colony. To prove his loyalty, Lafitte offered his crew of pirates to fight with Andrew Jackson in the upcoming battle. Jackson agreed, and when it was all said and done, he commended Lafitte, calling him, quote, the most ablest man in battle. While in New Orleans, Steve Austin caught malaria, which he would never fully recover from. In 1815, he ran and won a seat in the Missouri Territorial Legislature. His father Moses was the founder and principal stockholder of the Bank of St. Louis. The bank failed in the Panic of 1819. Moses still had a good relationship with the Spanish government, and in 1820 he went to San Antonio, Texas to request another land grant. In 1821, he was awarded the land grant on the condition that he moved 300 families onto it. On his way back to Missouri, he got ill and died soon after his return. To complicate things, the Mexicans had their own revolution in 1821 and threw the Spanish out. Steve Austin had to go to San Antonio and renegotiate the land grant, repeatedly, with multiple Mexican governments. Throughout the turmoil, he maintained the land grant. The settlement was called Austin, and it suffered every hardship a frontier town could. In 1830, Austin reached the goal of 300 families. Many Americans came to Texas, and many of them accepted Mexican citizenship. By the 1830s, the American Texans outnumbered Mexican Texans 10-1. Many of the new settlers didn't apply for legal land grants and illegally claimed land. Austin became the largest and most important settlement in Texas, and by default, being the leader of Austin made Steve Austin the spokesman for Texas.
At that time, Texas was in the northern part of a state called Coahuila, and in 1833, Stephen Austin traveled to Mexico City to request lower taxes and that Texas be granted its own statehood. A popular sentiment in Texas was it should succeed and become its own country. So to appease them, Stephen Austin prematurely wrote letters back to Texas telling them to prepare to become their own state. Mexico was quite aware of America's penchant for declaring independence, and they decided to act in Texas before that happened. On his trip back to Texas, Steve Austin was arrested. He was never charged with a crime, but he was jailed in Mexico City for 18 months. I've never heard anyone say, hey, you know what? That jail in Mexico City was so nice, I wish I could go back for 18 months. Well, 99 out of 100 Texans supported independence, and Steve Austin was the one that didn't. But after that 18 months, he joined the other 99.
On October 2nd, 1835, The Mexican army showed up in Gonzales, Texas to reclaim a cannon that had been given to the town to defend itself against Native American attacks. The town decided to keep their cannon and hoisted a flag that said, "Come take it." That day, the first shots of the Texas Revolution were fired, and the town of Gonzales got to keep their cannon. Steve Austin was placed in charge of the Texas Army, but he was no military man and was in poor health due to his malaria. Command of the Texas Army was given to another Virginian, Sam Houston, and the Battle of the Alamo happened under Houston's watch. The odds of the battle were similar to the odds of the Battle of New Orleans that Austin had witnessed years before. The results were very different though, if only there had been pirates at the Alamo. Steve Austin was given an equally important role. He became the envoy to the United States, seeking official recognition of Texas. He spent most of the war in Washington, D.C. When Mexico was defeated, he returned to Texas.
Sam Houston won the election, and he became the first president of Texas. But being the gracious winner, he made Steve Austin the Secretary of State. Unfortunately, the malaria won its lifelong battle against Steve Austin, and a few months after being made Secretary of State, in December 1836, he died in Austin, Texas. Steve Austin was born in a town named after him, and he died in a town named after him. How cool is that?
Heading towards a civil war.
The next person to own Austinville would be Thomas Jackson. He bought it in 1806 at a public auction in Richmond. Now in 1812, he built the shot tower, which is easily visible from Interstate 77.
The tower is 75 feet tall and has a 75-foot pit dug underneath it. Melted lead will be poured through different size screens to make different caliber of musket balls. As it dripped, it would free fall through the shaft, and during that 150-foot drop, the molten lead would form a sphere. At the bottom was a bucket of water, which would break the fall and cool the molten lead, making it keep its shape. There was a tunnel dug to the river, so after the musket balls were made, they could be carried right to boats for transportation.
The shot tower was only used until 1830, but during the Civil War, they decided to drip a little bit more lead through it. This episode of the Neighborhood Backwoods History and Travel channel was made possible in part because of viewers like you. Please, hook us both up and get yourself a t-shirt or one of my books to help fund the channel. And here's my other socials if you want to follow me on them.
This is Judge Andrew Fulton and his wife's house. It sits on a hill above the New River, just outside Austinville. Andrew Steele Fulton was born in Augusta County in 1800. He attended Hampton-Sydney University. Then he studied law under Judge Baldwin in Stanton. He passed the bar in 1825, and the next year he opened a law office in Abingdon. 2 years later, in 1826, he opened a law office in Wytheville, the Wythe County seat. He married Sarah Kincannon, and they had 9 kids. 12 years after moving to Wytheville, in 1840, he was elected to the State House of Delegates, and in 1845, he was elected to be the Wythe County Prosecuting Attorney. From 1847 to 1849, he served in the 13th U.S. Congress, but he did not run for re-election. He returned to private practice, and in 1852, he became the judge of the 15th Circuit. He held that position until 1869. The same year he became a judge, he bought a large tract of land outside Austinville and built this house. Currently, the house is 5,222 square feet, but the 2 wings you see on the outsides of the chimneys, those were added later. The house has 10-foot ceilings and 8-foot doors. Besides being a judge, After moving to Austinville, he began overseeing the lead mine and became a successful farmer growing corn and wheat. I'm not sure how long he worked at the mine, but in 1875 he sold them his property in Austinville, and that includes this house. One of the judge's sons married James McGavick's daughter, and another one of his sons married Major Graham's daughter. Major Graham's not in this story, but this is his house, and it's right down the street, and it's like a super duper famous haunted place, and it's been on a bunch of like TV shows and stuff, and everyone from Witt County is going to know exactly where I'm talking about. In 1856, the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad was completed. It ran from Lynchburg to Bristol, and it followed the Great Road through southwest Virginia. That meant it passed near Fort Chiswell. This was great for the mines, because now the lead only had to be moved a few miles. Daniel Sheffey and David Pierce took control of the mines in 1830. As the Civil War began, the only large-scale lead mining operation in the South was here. The mines were reorganized and renamed the Union Lead Company. They began operating around the clock. The mine produced over 3 million pounds of lead for the Southern Army. That's 1/3 of the lead that they used during the war. After West Virginia left Virginia, the lead mines were only 1 county away from northern lines. Needless to say, the mines were a valuable target for the North, but not an easy one. The first 2 attempts the North made ended with them running back to West Virginia long before they reached the mines. In December 1864, Northern forces under General Stoneman reached the mines and did as much damage as they could. The mine reopened in March, but the next month Stoneman returned and destroyed them again. 2 days later, the South surrendered at Appomattox. From lead to zinc, Steel Age industrialization. Wythe County has so many natural resources that 415 mines have been dug here. The shot tower that we talked about is on the county seal. It's kind of misleading though, because there's only one shot tower. But you know what they have a lot of here? Iron furnaces. This is the Foster Falls Iron Furnace, and it's right down the street from Austinville. Wythe County has all 3 ingredients needed to make iron: iron ore, coal, and limestone. Coming into the 1880s, Virginia was dominating the iron business, but unfortunately for them, in 1856 the Bessemer process was patented, and that was the first industrial scale technique of making steel. This is the Raven Cliff furnace, and it's not too far from Austinville either. Low quality coal can be used to produce iron, which only needs to be a few hundred degrees. But steel, which is smelted with other metals to change its properties, needs the highest quality ore and the highest quality coal to produce. The Steel Age ended the iron industry in Wythe County, but it caused a boom in Austinville. After the Civil War, they began mining zinc, and it's used to make galvanized steel. One of the properties of it is it doesn't rust, and during the Civil War, the first ironclad ships were ever used in a naval battle. After that, iron ships became more common, and the zinc was important to produce the galvanized steel to make the ships. To produce zinc, it has to be smelted, removing the zinc from the ore and purifying it. The process produces a byproduct. It's a white powdery substance that consists of lead, cadmium, and other heavy metals.
This is the Hale Wilkinson Carter House in nearby Hillsville, Virginia. Now, George Lafayette Carter is going to be the next person we're talking about, and he's the Carter in the name. The original structure was only 3 stories tall and was built in 1845 by Felden Hale. Wilkinson is going to buy it from Hale with Confederate money, and then George Lafayette Carter is going to marry Wilkinson's daughter, and that's how it's going to become the Carter House. A little bit past the time frame of our story, in 1924, George Carter is the one who renovated this house. He adds 2 stories to it, covers it with stucco, and adds some funky looking porches.
George Lafayette Carter was born in 1857 in Hillsville, Virginia. His father had lost his leg during the Civil War, and their family didn't have much. So at 16, George got a job at Johnson's General Store, and he earned 50 cents a week. In 1877, at the age of 20, he was hired by the Wythe Lead and Zinc Company. George was hired to be a bookkeeper and a buyer. He spent years working his way up the ladder until he became the manager. He began investing his money, buying land with iron ore and coal deposits. In 1898, the Wythe Lead and Zinc Company was sold to the Bertha Springs Mining Company. George took his investments and a business partner and formed the Virginia Iron and Coal Company. He isn't really important to Austinville history, but he is very important for the region's development. Besides his iron business, which went out of business as steel became more popular, he owned several small local railroads and brought in out-of-state investors to connect them with much larger lines. George helped establish the towns of Kingsport and Johnson City, Tennessee, to be manufacturing centers. He also founded the towns of Colwood and Coretta in West Virginia, and those were his mining towns.
In 1880, the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad was bought by an investment firm based in Philadelphia. Now, they already owned 3 railroads in Virginia and West Virginia. They consolidated the railroads and renamed them Norfolk and Western. Eager to play with their new toy, they began building 2 new lines. One went north, following the new river from Radford into the West Virginia coal fields.
They also started building another line, going south along the new river. It began in Pulaski, and in 1887 it reached Austinville. The line was completed in 1904 and stretched all the way to Galax, 50 miles away.
Going back to Austinville, Bertha Springs was the company that bought the mine in 1898. Now, they were from neighboring Pulaski County, and they're in a town called Allisonia. They had been mining zinc since 1854. Now, a fun fact about Bertha Springs is they are one of the 4 companies that formed the town of Pulaski, which is the Pulaski County seat. Now, a few years later, in 1901, the New Jersey Zinc Company comes to town, and they buy Bertha Springs. They also buy another zinc mining operation near Bertha Springs called the Passaic Zinc Company. And the year after they buy Bertha Springs, they buy Austinville. This is the New Jersey Zinc Company store. And now, company towns and company stores have a very negative connotation. But no one here will say anything bad about New Jersey Zinc Company, and they're very, very popular.
A new zinc oxide furnace was built in Austinville to recover zinc from the byproduct from the other local mines that they had bought. It took them 10 years to burn through that stash.
In 1912, the New Jersey Zinc Company established Palmerton, Pennsylvania. And the site was chosen because it was close to zinc mines and also close to high quality coal. And all the Wythe County zinc got loaded on the railroad, and it got sent up to Palmerton to get smelted.
This picture might be a little bit out of the timeline, but I believe it is of an updated version of what I am talking about. In 1924, the rapid rise technology was invented, and a mill was built that could treat 1,000 tons of ore a day. While the mill was being built, the Van Meter shaft was being dug. It was 1,200 feet deep and had separate mines branching off of it from different depths. World War I was a boom for the zinc industry, and America led its production until 1971. The Van Meter shaft is where the mine is now, but in 1953, they dug 2 more shafts. On the right you can see the Flatwood shaft, and it was dug to a depth of 700 feet. Then, across the river in the neighboring town of Ivanhoe, they dug another shaft, this one 1,100 feet deep. A 2.5-mile long tunnel was built, connecting all 3 mine shafts, and a 10-ton diesel locomotive carried ore to the surface. At that time, the mine employed 650 people. New Jersey Zinc Company came up with a new hustle, extracting limestone from the zinc byproduct. From 1925 to 1953, they sold 6.5 million tons of it to farmers so they could fertilize their fields. If you look at the top left picture, I'm pretty sure that's the company store that I was just standing in front of. In 1966, New Jersey Zinc was bought by Gulf and Western. In the early 1970s, the mine employed 200 people, but by the end of the decade, they had ceased underground mining due to the lack of demand and changes in environmental regulations. On December 31st, 1981, the mine closed. At that time, it was the oldest operating mine in America. The pumps were shut off, and the tunnel under the river began to flood, filling up the mine shafts too. It was still a company town, full of occupied company-owned homes. 12 staff houses were given to lead mine estates. Which are these houses? 64 non-staff houses, which would be these, were given to Newtown Inc.
To keep those houses with running water, those 2 companies got together and they formed the Austinville Sewer and Water Company. Byproducts from zinc mining include arsenic, cadmium, carbon, lead, fluorine, mercury, sulfur, and of course, zinc. In the early 1980s, environmental regulations involving the zinc industry began to change, and pretty much every zinc site in America became an EPA Superfund site. The New Jersey Zinc Company produced 4 EPA Superfund sites, and Austinville was one of them. Another issue that plagued all the zinc mining communities in America was sinkholes. Sinkholes would swallow buildings, and the company would then fill the holes in with the harmful byproduct. In most of my videos, the school closes because of population decline, but not here in Austinville. This is their elementary school, and it was closed when sinkholes started appearing underneath it.
The school is now owned by a church, and let me tell you, I spent a week trying to find a contact phone number, only to be left on red. I tried, y'all. Hope you enjoy the outside. Now right here, inside these windows, would have been Wythe County's first recreation center. There's a bowling alley in there, but you can't really see it now because of all the stuff the church has piled up. I just mentioned how every zinc mining area became an EPA cleanup site. So let's talk about a few more famous examples before we talk about Austinville. There's Pitcher, Oklahoma. The town was 100 years old and was based around the lead and zinc industry. For decades, they piled byproduct up around town until it was surrounded by mountains of white gravelly substance. No one knew the danger of the byproduct, and for decades it blew away with the wind and washed away with the rain. There was a place that the water flowed from an old mine shaft, creating a pond in the mountains of byproduct. It was called the beach by the locals, and on sunny days, families would go swimming there. But it didn't matter how much sunscreen you slapped the kids with. When they got done swimming, they would always get sunburned. And that's because the water from the mine shaft mixing with the byproduct was creating sulfuric acid. That was just one of dozens of ways that the residents of Pitcher began getting poisoned. The town was declared an EPA Superfund site in 1983. In 1994, testing was done of the students at the local school, and it was found that 34% of them were suffering from lead poisoning. The mine also created sinkholes, and buildings began to randomly fall into the earth. Eventually, the state and the EPA declared the land unsafe for human habitation and enacted a mandatory evacuation. If you've ever heard the phrase, history rhymes, that's it right there. Palmerton, Pennsylvania, where all the Wythe County zinc was being sent, also became an EPA Superfund site. Its pile of byproduct was called the Cinder Bank. It was 33 million tons, 100 foot tall, 2.5 miles long, and depending, 500 to 1,000 feet wide. Just like Pitcher, the cinder pile would blow away with the wind and wash away with the rain. The byproduct killed 2,000 acres of vegetation, and everything from frogs to children were tested and showed elevated lead levels. Fortunately for Palmerton, instead of being forced out like Pitcher, the EPA case is being closed. This was Austinville's pile of byproduct. On the pile of byproduct, it says, buy bonds or wear them, which is about buying war bonds. But to put in perspective how big this pile is, those letters are made with scrap planks of wood, and they are 28 feet high and 10 feet wide. The entire sign was about 300 feet long. On the left side of this picture, you can see the train, and that's going to be on the New River Plateau line. And on the right side of the picture, you can see a road and some houses by the river, and that's where the company store and the staff houses are. The EPA has since closed the case in Austinville. I had to put my snake gaiters on for this. Now what we're going to do is go explore this abandoned staff house that's down on the riverbank right next to the company store. And what this was a hotel for single miners. Most of the employees were fired when the mine was closed, but New Jersey Zinc continued selling limestone from their stockpiles. After the closing of the mine was announced, James River Limestone bought a portion of the land, including the mine. They tore down the old buildings and built new ones. They never reopened the mine, and they made an open-face quarry. The process that New Jersey Zinc used to extract limestone would leave piles of limestone dust deemed too small to use and dumped around the property. The problem with this limestone dust was it had high levels of lead and zinc in it. The James River Limestone Company began mixing that dust with the quarry limestone. Then, in 1984, Dixon Lumber bought 2,000 acres of land from New Jersey Zinc, but they didn't know about the piles of limestone dust until 1992, when they got a letter from the Water Control Board that the drainage system under the limestone was failing, and high levels of lead and zinc were flowing off their property and into the New River. In the court order, James River Limestone was hired to remove the piles and process it for resale, but Dixon Lumber was also paid royalties. Then, after a heavy rain in June 2013, more pollutants were leaked into the river, and an order to resolve the limestone powder was issued against Dixon. Dixon sued James River to have them share the expense, but lost the case.
In 1996, James River Limestone was bought out, and the Austinville mine was going to be closed. But 4 former employees bought the mine and they reopened it. For the next 10 years, they stayed small, only employing between 6 and 8 people and shipping out 150,000 tons of limestone a year. In 2006, the owners expanded into the home and garden business. They began selling baked limestone at garden shops and home improvement stores. By 2017, they had doubled their business, and in 2020, they made $1.4 million in sales. As industries changed and people stopped using the railroad for transportation, the New River Plateau line ran less and less. On October 5th, 1985, was the last time that Austinville would ever hear a train whistle, and the track was abandoned. The New Jersey Zinc Company was a blow that the railroad could not sustain.
The year after the line closed, Norfolk and Western donated the land to the state. The line is part of the Rails to Trails program, and in the 90s, the first section of the trail was completed, a 20-mile section that runs from Galax to Fries, and the entire 57-mile trail was open to the public in 2002. In 2010 and 11, Austinville Limestone restored 44 acres of land bordering the New River, removing remaining environmental issues, and they sold it to the state for a discounted price. It is now included in the New River Trail. The New River Trail State Park is the second most visited state park in Virginia.
As we enter the modern age, I know exactly what you're thinking. You're saying, hey, if that Fort Chiswell place is at the junction of two major interstates, why don't they build like a big shopping center or something there? Well, you'd be right, they did. Welcome to the Fort Chiswell Outlet Mall.
It was built behind the mansion and opened in 1989. It was easy to see from the highway, but hard to find, and it didn't have its own exit built in. Cashiers at the gas stations nearby would report that travelers would often come by and ask them for directions on how to get to it. The outlet mall was never fully occupied because of the slow business. Even in these old pictures, while the place looked so cheery and dressed up for the holidays, this is before Amazon, and the place should have been packed. But that was for highway people and suits on Wall Street making investments. For this part of Witt County, this was a big deal. Locally, it was a large employer, and everyone either worked there or their family did. The van in the picture is the country cruiser from FM 94 out of Marion. In 2012, the last store closed. It sat sad and lonely, while time and the elements faded the paint. Sadly, in 2018, the outlet mall died a natural death for an old building. It burnt down while teenagers were inside playing with matches.
Alright y'all, that's my video. I hope you liked it. If you did like it, hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. Don't be watching my stuff for free. Here's a couple more videos you might like.